The most dangerous mistake a person in power can make is believing they already know who stands before them. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp metallic snap that seemed to silence every sound around the front gate of Fort Redstone. Soldiers standing beyond the security checkpoint froze where they were. Civilian employees paused with coffee cups halfway to their lips. Even the breeze that carried the smell of fresh-cut grass across the sprawling installation seemed to lose its voice. A tall black man in faded blue jeans, worn brown boots, and a simple gray polo shirt stood perfectly still as Officer Blake Harrison tightened his grip on the situation he believed he completely understood. Harrison had worked law enforcement in the neighboring county for nearly 12 years. Around these roads that surrounded one of the nation's largest military installations, he considered himself the first line of defense against anything suspicious. That confidence had slowly become something else over the years. He trusted his instincts more than evidence, his assumptions more than explanations. And today, those instincts told him that the quiet man standing beside an aging dark green pickup truck did not belong anywhere near the secured entrance to the base. The man never raised his voice. He never argued. His expression remained calm, almost impossibly calm, despite the growing crowd gathering only a few yards away. His posture was straight without appearing confrontational, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying responsibility without needing to announce it. His silver hair was neatly trimmed. His weathered face carried lines earned through decades of service rather than age alone. Yet none of those details mattered to Harrison. All he saw was someone dressed too casually, driving an old truck, waiting near a restricted gate on one of the busiest mornings of the year. Unknown to nearly everyone watching, Fort Redstone was preparing for an unannounced readiness inspection involving senior military leadership from multiple commands across the country. Security had been heightened since sunrise. Vehicles rolled through additional checkpoints. Military police coordinated traffic while helicopters occasionally crossed overhead, their distant rotor blades blending into the clear Alabama sky. Every soldier on duty understood the importance of the day. Harrison believed he understood it too. "License," he demanded once again. The man reached slowly into his back pocket, moving carefully enough that no reasonable observer could mistake the gesture for anything threatening. He handed over a perfectly valid driver's license. Harrison glanced at it for less than 2 seconds before lowering it. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. The man complied immediately. No hesitation, no resistance, only quiet cooperation. Several soldiers exchanged uneasy looks behind the security barrier. One young sergeant whispered something to another service member before both fell silent again. They recognized something Harrison did not. The man looked toward the massive American flag waving above the entrance before returning his attention to the officer. His voice was steady, respectful, and remarkably composed. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Harrison folded his arms. "That's what everyone says." The man nodded slightly, almost as though he had expected that answer long before this morning began. Then he offered one sentence that hardly anyone nearby understood at the time. "You may want to notify the installation commander before this goes any further." Harrison laughed softly, shaking his head with complete confidence. "Nice try." The crowd remained silent. Somewhere beyond the gate, the distant sound of several approaching engines began to grow louder. The growing rumble of engines echoed across the entrance road, but Officer Blake Harrison paid little attention. His focus remained fixed on the man standing beside the weathered pickup truck, convinced that confidence without visible credentials was nothing more than another performance. Around them, the atmosphere outside Fort Redstone carried a quiet intensity that few civilians would have noticed. Convoys had been moving through the installation since dawn. Maintenance crews hurried between buildings with checklists in hand. Junior officers reviewed schedules one final time while senior leaders prepared for an inspection that had intentionally been kept confidential. Every minute mattered. Every detail would soon be examined. Yet only a few hundred feet from the main gate, an entirely different test was unfolding, one that no official briefing had anticipated. Lieutenant General Victor Freeman stood without complaint, his hands resting calmly in front of him. He had spent more than 3 decades making decisions under pressure, leading thousands of service members through natural disasters, humanitarian missions, and complex overseas operations. Experience had taught him that character revealed itself most clearly when authority went unquestioned. That lesson had followed him throughout his career, from his first days as a young lieutenant to the highest levels of military leadership. This morning was supposed to be simple. He had deliberately left his government vehicle behind, choosing instead to drive his old pickup, the same truck he had owned for years. He preferred arriving quietly, speaking with enlisted personnel before ceremonies began, and seeing the installation exactly as it functioned on an ordinary day. Titles often changed the way people behaved. Ordinary clothes did not. Harrison circled the truck slowly, examining every corner as though expecting to uncover something suspicious. The faded paint, small scratches, and worn tires only reinforced the story he had already created in his mind. He glanced back toward Victor with a look that mixed certainty with impatience. "You expect me to believe someone important drives this?" he asked. Victor answered with the same measured tone he had used from the beginning. "I expect you to evaluate facts before reaching conclusions." The response was neither sarcastic nor confrontational. If anything, it sounded like advice from someone accustomed to teaching young leaders. Harrison dismissed it immediately. Nearby, several military police officers watched from inside the security checkpoint. Regulations prevented them from interfering with a civilian law enforcement encounter unless specific jurisdictional issues arose, but their expressions grew, increasingly uneasy. One staff sergeant quietly reached for the radio attached to his vest before another soldier gently lowered his arm with a subtle shake of the head. Something about the man's voice, his posture, and his unwavering composure seemed strangely familiar. A retired civilian employee standing near the visitor center narrowed his eyes, studying Victor's face. He whispered to the receptionist beside him, trying to remember where he had seen that calm expression before. It lingered somewhere deep in his memory, perhaps from an official ceremony or a command briefing years earlier, but the answer refused to surface. Harrison noticed none of it. He remained convinced that the crowd was simply curious. Folding Victor's driver's license back into his pocket, he spoke with absolute confidence. "Until I know exactly why you are here, you are staying right where you are." Victor looked briefly toward the road leading into the installation, where the distant sound of multiple vehicles continued growing louder with every passing second. Then he met Harrison's eyes once more and quietly replied, "I have been exactly where I was supposed to be all morning. The question is whether everyone else has." The distant convoy finally came into view beyond the rolling hills that surrounded Fort Redstone. Sunlight reflected across a line of dark military sport utility vehicles as they moved with quiet precision toward the installation, escorted by military police motorcycles whose flashing lights caught the attention of everyone near the front gate. Conversations faded almost instantly. Soldiers instinctively straightened their posture. Civilian contractors stepped aside. Even those who had only been watching out of curiosity suddenly sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Officer Blake Harrison glanced briefly toward the approaching vehicles before returning his attention to Victor Freeman. In his mind, the timing meant nothing. Important visitors arrived at military bases every day, and he believed his own responsibilities remained unchanged. "Looks like your audience is getting bigger," he said with a confident smile that suggested he still expected the situation to end exactly as he had imagined. Victor answered only with a calm expression. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no sign that he welcomed what was coming next. If anything, he seemed disappointed that events had reached this point at all. He had hoped the misunderstanding would have ended with a simple conversation. He had spent an entire career teaching that leadership began with listening before judging, and this morning had become an unexpected reminder that those lessons were never truly finished. A young private standing behind the security barrier quietly leaned toward the senior non-commissioned officer beside him. "Sergeant, that man looks familiar," he whispered. The older soldier continued watching without answering. His eyes narrowed as memories slowly surfaced from command briefings, official portraits, and ceremonies held inside the headquarters building. The face before him belonged somewhere important. He simply could not place it quickly enough. Harrison noticed several soldiers staring in Victor's direction and interpreted their silence as support for his actions. Confident that he had complete control of the situation, he folded his arms and addressed the growing crowd. Everything is under control. There is nothing to see here. Yet almost no one looked at him anymore. Their attention had shifted toward the convoy that continued, closing the final few hundred yards. The lead vehicle slowed before reaching the checkpoint, followed by several identical black sport utility vehicles that came to a smooth stop with remarkable precision. Uniformed personnel stepped out first, scanning the area with practiced professionalism before opening the rear passenger door of the center vehicle. A tall officer wearing a perfectly pressed Army service uniform emerged with measured confidence. The silver star on each shoulder caught the morning light as he surveyed the scene with calm authority. Brigadier General Thomas Caldwell had commanded Fort Redstone for nearly 4 years. His reputation throughout the Army rested on discipline, fairness, and unwavering respect for every soldier under his command. He had been expecting one particular visitor. That morning, although even he had not known the exact arrival time because the inspection had been intentionally unscheduled. As his eyes swept across the entrance, they settled on one familiar face standing quietly beside an old pickup truck. For the briefest moment, confusion crossed his expression. Then he noticed the handcuffs. The change in his face was immediate. Without hesitation, he walked away from his waiting staff and headed directly toward Victor Freeman. Every soldier nearby snapped instinctively to attention. Conversations disappeared completely. The only sounds remaining were the gentle rustling of the American flag above the gate and the steady footsteps of the installation commander approaching the man whom Officer Blake Harrison still believed was nothing more than an ordinary civilian brigadier. General Thomas Caldwell stopped only a few feet away, his eyes fixed on Lieutenant General Victor Freeman with unmistakable concern. For a long second, neither man spoke. The silence itself seemed to command the attention of everyone gathered outside the gate. Then, with flawless military precision, Caldwell raised his right hand in a sharp salute. Every soldier within sight immediately followed. Boots clicked against the pavement almost in unison as dozens of service members stood at rigid attention. The sudden transformation swept across the entrance like a wave. Officer Blake Harrison remained frozen, unable to understand why an installation commander would salute a man standing beside an old pickup truck in faded jeans and a gray polo shirt. Victor returned the salute with the same quiet professionalism that had defined every moment since Harrison first approached him. Only after lowering his hand did Caldwell speak. "Good morning, sir. I sincerely apologize for your delay." His voice carried neither anger nor panic, only respect. The words landed heavily across the crowd. Harrison blinked several times, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. "Sir," he repeated almost involuntarily. Caldwell turned slowly toward the county officer. His expression remained controlled, but the warmth that had been present while greeting Victor disappeared entirely. "Officer," he said calmly, "you are speaking with Lieutenant General Victor Freeman, the senior inspecting officer scheduled to conduct today's readiness evaluation of this installation." The sentence seemed to drain every sound from the entrance. The retired civilian employee near the visitor center suddenly covered his mouth as recognition finally struck him. The young private who had struggled to remember Victor's face whispered under his breath, "I knew I had seen him before." Several soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had just witnessed one of the highest-ranking officers they would ever encounter being treated like an ordinary suspect. Harrison looked from Caldwell to Victor and then back again, searching desperately for some sign that this was an elaborate misunderstanding. His confident posture began to fade. "There has to be some mistake," he said quietly. Caldwell answered without raising his voice. "There is a mistake, officer, but it is not the one you believe." Victor remained composed, offering no interruption and no criticism. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing discomfort spreading through the crowd. Caldwell extended a respectful glance toward Victor before addressing the military police standing nearby. "Please remove the restraints from General Freeman immediately." A military police sergeant stepped forward with careful professionalism. Harrison instinctively reached toward the handcuffs before stopping himself, suddenly uncertain of every decision he had made during the past 20 minutes. The restraints were removed without ceremony. Victor gently rubbed one wrist for only a moment before letting both hands rest naturally at his sides. There was no visible frustration, no demand for apologies, and no attempt to embarrass anyone standing before him. Instead, he looked directly at Harrison with steady eyes that reflected disappointment more than anger. "Officer," Victor said quietly, "rank exists to serve others, not to place anyone above them. Respect should never depend on a uniform, a title, or the color of someone's skin." No one moved. No one interrupted. The words settled over the entrance far more heavily than any shouted accusation ever could. Standing beneath the waving American flag, surrounded by soldiers who had dedicated their lives to service, the lesson reached far beyond one mistaken encounter. It challenged every person present to ask themselves a simple but uncomfortable question. How often do first impressions become final judgments before the truth is ever given a chance to speak? An uncomfortable silence lingered over the entrance long after the handcuffs had been removed. The soldiers remained at attention until Lieutenant General Victor Freeman gave the slightest nod, signaling them to relax. One by one, shoulders eased, but the atmosphere did not. Every person standing near the checkpoint understood they had witnessed something that would be remembered long after the inspection ended. Brigadier General Thomas Caldwell stepped closer to Victor, his voice measured and respectful. "Sir, headquarters has been waiting for your arrival. The command staff is assembled in the operations center." Victor glanced briefly toward the administration buildings beyond the gate before looking back at the small crowd gathered around them. "They can wait another few minutes," he replied calmly. "There is something more important that should happen first." Caldwell immediately understood. Leadership was not only demonstrated inside conference rooms or during formal ceremonies. Sometimes its greatest lessons unfolded in parking lots, at security gates, and in ordinary moments when people least expected them. Officer Blake Harrison stood motionless beside his patrol vehicle. The confidence that had defined him only minutes earlier had disappeared, replaced by uncertainty that was visible in every movement. He opened his mouth several times, searching for words that refused to come. He had replayed the encounter in his mind over and over within only a few seconds, recognizing each assumption he had accepted as fact without taking the time to verify it. The old pickup truck, the casual clothing, the quiet confidence. None of those things had actually told him who Victor Freeman was. They had only reflected the story Harrison had chosen to believe. Victor slowly walked toward him, stopping at a respectful distance. No cameras moved closer. No soldiers spoke. The only sound came from a flag gently moving above the gate as the summer breeze carried the distant rhythm of morning drills across the installation. "Officer Harrison," Victor said, his voice calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "Throughout my career, I have commanded soldiers from every background imaginable. Some grew up in large cities. Others came from small farming towns. Some drove expensive cars. Others arrived in vehicles older than they were. None of those things ever told me whether they possessed integrity." Harrison lowered his eyes. "General," Victor gently raised one hand, not to silence him, but to remove the pressure of immediate explanation. "Every leader makes mistakes," he continued. "The question is never whether mistakes happen. The question is whether we have the courage to learn from them before someone else pays the price." Those words settled over the gathering with remarkable weight. Several young soldiers exchanged thoughtful glances. They had expected anger. Some had expected demands for punishment. Instead, they were witnessing something entirely different. Caldwell quietly observed the faces around him and realized that this unexpected lesson would likely influence more future leaders than the scheduled inspection ever could. Harrison finally looked up. His expression carried genuine regret rather than embarrassment. "I should have listened instead of assuming," he admitted softly. Victor offered a slight nod. Listening is where respect begins. The statement was simple, yet no one present could ignore its meaning. Before turning toward the gate, Victor looked once more at the assembled soldiers, civilian employees, military police, and county officers standing together in unusual silence. "Every person who enters this installation deserves to be treated with dignity until facts prove otherwise," he said. "That standard protects more than individuals. It protects the values we all claim to represent." Without another word, he began walking toward the headquarters building, leaving behind not a scene of humiliation, but a lesson that would continue echoing across Fort Redstone long after the morning inspection officially began inside the headquarters building. The mood was noticeably different from what anyone had expected only 30 minutes earlier. Senior officers who had gathered for the readiness inspection stood as Lieutenant General Victor Freeman entered the conference room alongside Brigadier General Thomas Caldwell. Conversations stopped immediately. Large digital displays showing operational schedules, training readiness, and logistical reports filled the walls, but Victor's attention drifted briefly toward the wide windows overlooking the entrance gate. From that distance, Officer Blake Harrison's patrol vehicle was barely visible, yet the events that had unfolded there remained fresh in everyone's mind. Caldwell quietly closed the conference room door before addressing the assembled leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's inspection will proceed as scheduled." He paused for a moment before adding, "However, the most important lesson of the day has already taken place outside this building." Several officers exchanged thoughtful looks. They understood exactly what he meant. Victor slowly removed a leather notebook from his briefcase and placed it on the polished conference table without opening it. "Before we begin reviewing reports," he said, "I would like to ask a simple question." His calm voice carried effortlessly across the room. "How many of you believe readiness is measured only by equipment, budgets, and training scores?" No hands were raised. "Good," Victor replied with a faint smile. "Because readiness begins with judgment." The room remained silent as he continued. "Every military installation invests countless hours preparing people to respond under pressure. We rehearse emergencies until our reactions become instinct. We train leaders to solve problems quickly. But speed without fairness creates new problems instead of solving existing ones." Several battalion commanders nodded almost instinctively. The lesson reached beyond military doctrine. It spoke directly to leadership itself. Victor finally opened the notebook. Rather than pages filled with inspection checklists, there were handwritten observations collected over decades of service. Short notes, names, dates, lessons learned from both success and failure. He looked toward a young colonel seated near the end of the table. "Colonel, what is the first responsibility of a leader?" The officer answered confidently, "To accomplish the mission, sir." Victor nodded. "Correct. And what protects the mission?" The colonel hesitated. Another officer quietly answered, "Trust, sir." Victor smiled again. "Exactly." He closed the notebook. Trust cannot survive where assumptions replace facts. Meanwhile, outside the headquarters building, Officer Blake Harrison remained near the entrance gate, unable to shake the conversation from his mind. The routine sounds of traffic had returned. Visitors continued arriving. Soldiers showed identification and entered the installation as they always had. Everything looked ordinary again, yet nothing felt ordinary to him. A veteran civilian employee approached before preparing to leave for the day. The older man paused beside Harrison's patrol vehicle. "Son," he said gently, "I worked on this base for 28 years. I met generals who flew helicopters and privates who rode bicycles. I stopped guessing who people were a long time ago." Harrison managed a quiet nod. "I understand that now." The older man smiled kindly before walking away. It was not a lecture. It was simply wisdom earned through experience. As the morning sun climbed higher above Fort Redstone, Victor Freeman began the official inspection exactly on schedule. He reviewed maintenance records, visited training facilities, and greeted young enlisted soldiers with the same humility he had shown outside the gate. Few people realized that the formal inspection would produce excellent ratings across nearly every category. Yet among everyone present that day, the report most likely to be remembered would never appear on official paperwork. It had already been written in the minds of those who witnessed how true leadership responded when dignity was tested instead of defended by rank alone. By late afternoon, the inspection had concluded. But the conversations it inspired continued throughout Fort Redstone. Officers who had spent years evaluating equipment now found themselves discussing judgment. Young soldiers who had expected another routine inspection spoke quietly about the importance of humility. The story of what had happened at the front gate traveled across offices, motor pools, maintenance bays, and dining facilities faster than any official memorandum ever could. Yet inside a modest conference room overlooking the parade field, Lieutenant General Victor Freeman was reviewing the final inspection summary with Brigadier General Thomas Caldwell. The numbers were impressive. Operational readiness exceeded expectations. Training completion rates ranked among the highest in the region. Safety compliance remained outstanding. Caldwell looked across the table with a sense of quiet pride. "Sir, I appreciate your fairness today," he said. "Many people expected this morning to end very differently." Victor closed the report without commenting on the scores. "Readiness is easier to measure than character," he replied. "One is recorded on paper. The other reveals itself when no one expects to be evaluated." Caldwell understood exactly what he meant. Unknown to most personnel on the installation, Victor had intentionally visited bases in ordinary clothing for years. Not to trap people, not to embarrass them, but to experience the culture they created when titles were invisible. Some installations welcomed every visitor with equal professionalism. Others unknowingly treated appearance as a substitute for identity. Those observations often told him more about leadership than formal presentations ever could. At the county sheriff's office, several miles away, Officer Blake Harrison sat alone in the small briefing room after completing the required incident report. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. Reading his own words forced him to confront something he had avoided for years. He had described behaviors. He had documented procedures. But nowhere could paperwork fully explain how quickly assumptions had replaced careful judgment. His supervising lieutenant entered quietly and placed another folder on the table. "We reviewed the body camera footage," the lieutenant said calmly. "This is not about one mistake anymore. It is about understanding how the mistake happened." Harrison nodded without argument. For the first time in his career, he listened without trying to defend himself. Later that evening, as the golden light of sunset stretched across the parade field, Victor walked alone toward the flagpole near headquarters. A group of young soldiers recognized him and respectfully greeted him as they passed. He returned every greeting with the same warmth, never allowing rank to create unnecessary distance. One young specialist finally gathered enough courage to ask a question. "Sir, after everything that happened this morning, were you angry?" Victor looked toward the American flag moving gently against the evening sky before answering. "Disappointment lasts longer than anger," he said thoughtfully. "Anger focuses on a single moment. Disappointment asks how many similar moments happened before no one was watching." The young soldier remained silent, reflecting on those words. Victor continued walking slowly across the grass. "Never measure people by the first story your mind creates," he added. "Give the truth enough time to introduce itself." As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, the lights around Fort Redstone gradually illuminated the quiet streets. The installation looked peaceful once again, but everyone who had witnessed the events of that morning carried home something far more valuable than an inspection score. They carried a reminder that genuine leadership was never displayed through authority alone. It was revealed through patience, fairness, and a willingness to see the person before the uniform, the title, or the assumptions that so easily clouded both the following Monday morning, Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the county training academy as officers from across the region gathered for their monthly professional development session. Most expected another routine presentation covering updated procedures, community outreach, and legal standards. Instead, the large screen at the front of the room displayed only a single sentence in plain white letters against a dark background. Every decision begins before the first word is spoken. Quiet conversations faded as the room filled. Officer Blake Harrison took a seat near the back, saying little as colleagues greeted one another. The events at Fort Redstone had remained on his mind throughout the weekend. He had replayed every moment repeatedly, not because anyone forced him to, but because he finally understood how quickly confidence could become assumption when left unchecked. The academy director stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone before introducing an unexpected guest. Lieutenant General Victor Freeman entered without fanfare, wearing the same calm expression that had remained unchanged throughout the previous week. He was dressed in a simple business suit instead of a military uniform, making him appear much like any experienced professional invited to speak. The room rose to its feet out of respect, and Victor acknowledged them with a polite nod before approaching the microphone. "Thank you for inviting me," he began. "I'm not here because of what happened last week. I am here because what happened last week could happen anywhere." The room became completely still. Victor did not mention names. He did not describe the encounter in detail. Instead, he spoke about leadership, responsibility, and the quiet influence every public servant carried into each interaction. "Every badge," he said, "every uniform, every position of authority represents a promise. People may not remember every conversation you have, but they will remember how you made them feel when they were at their most vulnerable." Several officers lowered their eyes as they reflected on their own careers. Victor continued without raising his voice. "The greatest danger is not making a mistake. The greatest danger is believing you are incapable of making one." Harrison listened carefully, recognizing that every sentence applied to him without ever being directed at him personally. There was no public embarrassment, no accusation, only an invitation to grow. When the presentation ended, the audience responded with a long-standing ovation that reflected genuine respect rather than obligation. As the room gradually emptied, Harrison remained in his seat until nearly everyone had left. Finally, he walked toward Victor, stopping a few feet away. "General Freeman," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for not defining me by my worst decision." Victor looked at him with the same calm steadiness he had shown since the morning they first met. "None of us should be remembered only for our worst day," he replied, "but we should all be changed by it." Harrison nodded slowly. "I intend to be." Victor extended his hand, and Harrison accepted it with quiet gratitude. There were no cameras to capture the moment. No reporters waiting outside. Only two men standing in a nearly empty room, proving that genuine accountability does not always arrive through punishment. Sometimes it begins with humility, continues through honest reflection, and becomes lasting change when a person chooses to learn instead of defend their pride. As Victor walked toward the exit, Harrison remained standing for a moment longer, watching the door close behind him. For the first time in many years, he realized that true authority was never measured by the power to judge another person. It was measured by the discipline to judge oneself first. Several months later, autumn settled quietly over Fort Redstone. The trees lining the main boulevard had turned shades of gold and crimson, and a cool breeze carried fallen leaves across the sidewalks where young recruits hurried between training buildings. Life on the installation had returned to its familiar rhythm, yet some stories never truly ended. They simply became part of the culture. Inside the largest auditorium on base, hundreds of newly assigned soldiers filled the seats for their leadership orientation. They expected to hear about regulations, responsibilities, and the traditions of military service. Instead, Brigadier General Thomas Caldwell stepped to the podium holding a thin folder that contained no charts, no inspection reports, and no performance statistics. He looked across the room before speaking. "Today," he began, "I could spend the next hour explaining policies. Instead, I want to tell You about a morning that reminded every leader on this installation what service really means. The auditorium became completely silent. Without mentioning anyone's mistakes by name, Caldwell described a simple encounter at the front gate. He spoke about assumptions, patience, dignity, and the quiet strength of a man who chose wisdom over pride. He explained that the greatest lesson from that day had not been about military rank. It had been about character that remained unchanged, whether recognized or ignored. As the story came to an end, he invited one final guest to the stage. Lieutenant General Victor Freeman walked forward to warm applause. Looking across the rows of young faces, he smiled with the same calm humility that had guided him throughout his career. "Every one of you will wear this uniform," he said. "Some of you will one day wear higher rank than you ever imagined. But never believe that rank is what earns respect. Rank gives you responsibility. Your character determines whether you deserve the trust that comes with it." Every soldier listened carefully. Some wrote down every word. Others simply watched, knowing they were hearing advice that no textbook could fully teach. Victor paused before continuing. "Long after people forget your title, they will remember how you treated them when you had the power to make their day easier or harder. That choice belongs to you every single time." Near the back of the auditorium stood Officer Blake Harrison. He had been invited by Caldwell after completing additional leadership and community engagement training over the previous months. His perspective had changed in ways he never expected. He now volunteered to help instruct new officers on the importance of slowing down, asking questions, and recognizing how quickly assumptions could shape decisions. Watching Victor speak, Harrison understood that true redemption was never found in pretending the past had not happened. It was found in allowing the past to build a better future. As the ceremony concluded, the audience rose for one final round of applause that echoed throughout the hall. Outside, the American flag waved steadily beneath a bright blue sky as soldiers, officers, civilian employees, and visitors crossed paths along the same sidewalks where countless stories had unfolded before them. Some wore decorated uniforms. Others wore ordinary clothes. Yet each person carried the same dignity that deserved to be recognized before judgment was ever passed. Victor paused briefly before leaving the building, looking once more toward the entrance gate where everything had begun. A faint smile crossed his face, not because he had won anything, but because one difficult morning had become an opportunity for countless others to grow. And perhaps that was the quiet truth leadership had always been trying to teach. A uniform can reveal a person's rank, but only character reveals who they truly are. The strongest leaders never ask the world to look at their title first. They live in such a way that their integrity speaks long before anyone learns their name. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.